studios of Penn State Public Broadcasting, tonight's program is part of WPSU's Common Ground Lobby Talk series. Here's host Patty Satalia.
Welcome to tonight's Common Ground Lobby Talk, a conversation with investigative reporter Mark Schapiro. I'm Patty Satalia. Toxic chemicals in everything from clothes, food packaging, cosmetics, toys, and electronics are finding their way into our bloodstream. And evidence is mounting that these chemicals are causing rising infertility, endocrine-related malformations, and neurological disorders. In response, the European Union has asserted new and tougher standards that our guest says are not only good for public health, but are also profitable. Meanwhile, the United States is becoming a dumping ground for potentially dangerous products refused by other nations. Why are Americans exposed while others are protected? How do lax environmental laws impact the U.S. economy? And what can we do to protect ourselves from a variety of hidden dangers? We'll talk about that and more, and we invite our studio audience to join the conversation. Our guest is Mark Schapiro. He is editorial director of the Center for Investigative Reporting in San Francisco. He's also author of Exposed: The Toxic Chemistry of Everyday Products and What's at Stake for American Power. Mark Schapiro, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
You have been an investigative journalist for more than 2 decades, and you have written extensively about the environment and about international affairs. What about this particular topic first sparked your interest?
Well, what sparked my interest was, one, the extraordinary sort of way in which we are routinely exposed to chemicals around which there are a great deal of suspicions in terms of their effects on our health. And I was kind of amazed to begin learning about those chemicals. And then what actually really prompted me to actually go and write a book was the idea that in this world that we inhabit, there is another place that is comparable to us here in the United States that has actually been systematically removing these chemicals from circulation. And you know, we're talking about chemicals that cause cancer, that cause birth defects, that cause reproductive problems, that cause mutation in human genes. And so what got me going, because I've been following environmental issues for so long and watched these battles happen for so long, is I suddenly realized that for the first time in history, these chemicals are actually being removed, but not from America. And so I probed very deeply into what was happening actually in the European Union, which is now the world's largest economy, 27 countries, almost 500 million people. And if you look at this economy, which is now comparable to that of the United States in sophistication and affluence and everything, I realized they're removing these chemicals from circulation and they're not having these catastrophic consequences. So my question was, why not here in America?
Well, let's step back, because it was the United States actually that introduced the very first piece of legislation related to controlling these chemicals. That was back in 1976, and it was the Toxic Substance Control Act. Tell us about that act and what impact it had not only here in this country, but worldwide.
I mean, what's interesting is the United States really used to be the world's leader on environmental protection. There's no question about it. And back in the 70s, early 80s, the United States was way at the front of protecting people from environmental hazards. And we were the first to come up with the Environmental Protection Agency, invented right here in America, and then emulated all around the world. We were the first to begin regulating the contaminants in our air and our water. And we're the first country to even start paying attention to chemicals. We had all these chemicals. A lot of them came up after World War II. They were having effects that scientists were noticing, and so the United States was the first to say, wait a minute, maybe we should look at these chemicals and figure out what they all are out there. So in the 70s, in the mid-70s, the United States passed a law called the Toxic Substances Control Act, like you said, and that law was the world's first to say, all right, we want data on these chemicals, we want to understand what they potentially do to our body, and how we might potentially control their effects on our health. And that all sounds great. The problem is,
there was a loophole.
There was a loophole. There's always one of these loopholes, and it was a loophole you could drive about 5,000 trucks through in any given day. And that loophole basically said that any chemical on the market as of 1981, I realize it's going back a ways now, but if you can try to imagine 1981, any chemical on the market as of 1981 was grandfathered onto the market. No data required.
Give us an idea of how many chemicals we're talking about.
So we're talking about some 60,000 chemicals on the market as of 1981. Today, what really is striking is 90% of the chemicals on the market today predated 1981. So there's no requirement.
So we're testing 10%.
We're testing 10%. But we're testing 10% officially, but now the other altogether we're actually experimenting on because we're all part of this great experiment. I mean, we are part of an experiment that's going on. You just may not be aware of it, but we are all being experimented upon by the chemicals that we encounter on a daily basis, so we're learning what those effects are.
Now, you say in your book that this new science of biomonitoring really shows the extent to which TOSCA, the TOSCA, the extent to which that law has failed us. Tell us what we're finding in the bloodstreams of Americans and Europeans throughout the 27-member countries of the European Union.
Well, the main thing that we are finding both in America and Europe and in other developed countries is that these chemicals, when you encounter them on a daily basis, it's not like they go disappear. What do you think they do? Go evaporate into the air. They actually, when you breathe them in, when you rub them on your body, when you're exposed to them in some form or other, in the dust or in just the rubbing products, the substances enter into the bloodstream. So the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, is finding out that the average American has 148 chemicals in their blood. That means you and I and everybody else out here and everybody out there and everybody beyond out there has...
No, wait a minute. You just said the Centers for Disease Control says we have 145 of these chemicals in our body, but it's not the United States government that's starting to do something about this. It's the EU.
Exactly. So here in America, 148 chemicals, average American. The question is, what is our government doing about it? And the answer is, unfortunately, very little. And the U.S. government has not been regulating the safety of these chemicals. If you think that the government is out there determining what's safe and what's not safe, that is not, unfortunately, true. And what is true is that when you compare what's happening, and what I found very interesting was to look at what happened when you have this scientific information. The scientific information is out there. We have rising rates of cancer. We have rising rates of reproductive troubles among young women, declining rates of sperm among young men. We have rising rates of asthma, other conditions. And what we have is actually a growing knowledge of what the chemicals that we encounter on a daily basis, the possible contributions they could be making to these conditions. And this is all because the science of toxicology has gotten much more sophisticated. So the question is, what does the government do in the face of that information? Well, one, the U.S. government has done close to nothing about that information. The European Union, however, has been taking an entirely different approach to the same scientific information. And
using our data.
Using our data. So many times the United States, I mean, this is what I found amazing, is I talked to scientists, some of whom work for the EPA, our own EPA, who tell me, well, I produced this data on, for example, phthalates, little plastic softener that's used in toys, in children's toys, that some EPA scientists were finding could disrupt the production of testosterone in young males, and which of course is the sexual hormone for males. And they told me, you know, we produced this research. Nobody in Washington wanted to read it. There was nobody in Washington to send it to. So they ended up sending it straight to Brussels, which is the capital of the European Union, where policymakers there acted on that information. So over and over and over again, you have the same scientific information, the same evidence, very different responses between here in the United States and in Europe.
I want to read a quote from your book, and then I want to take a question from the audience. But in your book, you write about children sleeping in pajamas treated with cancer-causing flame retardants, sucking on bottles laced with plastic additives believed to alter hormones, diapers glued together with nerve-damaging toxins normally used to kill algae on the hulls of ships. Tell us a little bit about the EU's response, and what I'm specifically asking about is the new legislation known as REACH.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That those findings, like you said, toxins in baby diapers and in pajamas, and what happened was an enormous popular movement grew up actually in Europe, where parents got out in front of their capitals in the capital cities in London and Amsterdam and The Hague and the Holland and Paris, and protested, said, "This is an outrage. This is an outrage. We're going to subject our children to these poisons without even knowing it. How dare you allow us to do this?" And that began a whole movement that actually swept across Europe, and it was amazing. It just built and built and built, particularly as people discovered about their kids. And what that prompted the European Union to do is say, hey, wait a minute, let's figure out what these chemicals are, because many of these chemicals, because of this great loophole, had never even been registered, had never even been assessed for their toxicity. Now scientists were finding independently about that. So the Europeans have passed a law called REACH, which stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization of Chemicals, long acronym, which basically says all those chemicals that have never been assessed for their toxicity, let's look at them. We don't trust you anymore.
They want to look at.
Those tens of thousands of chemicals. When the United States passed this law at TSCA back in the 70s, the rest of the world followed, including the big loophole. So the huge loophole through the mountaintop basically was followed by Europe and everybody else. But now, starting about 5 or 6 years ago, the Europeans were, wait a minute, we're talking about tens of thousands of chemicals we know nothing about. Time to start collecting data. So right now, and it actually kicked into gear at the end of 2008, any company selling a product containing chemicals in Europe has to submit toxicity data.
And then this information is public so that the
right. So
published rather, so the public can see it.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, what I found amazing was that companies like Dow Chemical, for example, DuPont, all the major American companies, they are taking literally this big package of information about the toxicity of their substances and shipping them right over the head of Washington to the Europeans' chemical office to be looked at there, because they require this. And the United States doesn't even require this information. So we're emerging into this dual world here. I mean, that's what I found kind of interesting in the book, was to realize that we have this dual universe emerging, and the United States is falling seriously behind, you know.
And all along, we might add, in your book, you point out the fact that even the Secretary of State was lobbying U.S. embassies overseas, saying, we've got to eliminate this REACH, this is going to thwart innovation, this is going to have a negative impact on trade, this can't happen. People from the chemical industry were lobbying. You say, the people you talked to said it was becoming more than annoying.
More than annoying, yes. I would say, I talked to, if people can imagine the U.S. Congress, we understand the U.S. Congress, but if you think of the U.S. Congress, the equivalent of the U.S. Congress in the European Union, which has its own version of the Congress called the Parliament, European Parliament, which makes a lot of laws for Europeans, and people in that body were telling me they were deluged with visits by American people from the Bush administration, telling them, don't do these measures, you know, you can't do this to us. It's America that's leading this charge, not you, and trying to stop these things from happening. And then the industry, American industry, moved wholesale lobbying operations from Washington to Brussels. So Brussels is, of course, the capital of the European Union. You had a huge shift of lobbying activity from Washington to Brussels by all the big firms, the Burson Marstellers and the Hill and Knowltons, all went over to Brussels, representing big American companies, trying to slow what the Europeans were doing. Made a lot of people very angry, and actually created numerous people in the Parliament and elsewhere in European government told me it essentially created a backlash, where people said, if the United States is actually pushing this on it, there's got to be something wrong with this position, and went the opposite way. And that's in the end what happened.
And what has the economic impact been in Europe to requiring companies there to reformulate, to eliminate these toxic chemicals?
Well, that is a key question, because you know, I've been reporting these things for like years. For 20 years, I've been reporting environmental matters. And over and over in the chemical area, you hear the industries say, you know, you're overreacting, you're kind of freaking out, you're going to drive us out of business if we take this stuff off the market, we're going to lose jobs, lose competitive position. So I decided to say, all right, when the Europeans did this, when they took these substances, major companies here, we're not talking about boutique companies, major multinational billion-dollar companies taking toxic substances out of their products. And I decided, all right, what's happened to the cosmetics industry? What happened to the toy industry? What happened to the electronics industry? What happened to the auto industries? All these major firms that have had to actually take these substances out. And I said, all right, what happened economically? And look at that information, which I do in the book. And I found out that, in fact, those industries, not only are they not losing jobs, they're actually, in many cases, gaining jobs, and they are actually often gaining competitive position vis-a-vis American firms, because many people around the world now, including Americans, by the way, are becoming more aware of these issues and are beginning to compare side by side a European product, an American product. One's gone through a toxic screen, the other hasn't, and what are they going to buy, especially when the prices are comparable. So the whole notion that these kind of environmental reforms are going to drive American industry out of business, I think, has been a ruse, really.
Probably the most disturbing thing is that some American companies are reformulating for sale in Europe, but selling us the old stuff here in the U.S.
Yes, that is absolutely the most disturbing thing that I found, that somehow the United States of America is now becoming a dumping ground for products that are banned elsewhere in the world.
Let's go to a question.
Mark, when you mentioned the toxicity levels that were reported, my concern is that you might have one product where the toxicity level, according to the research, is okay. For example, maybe dishwashing liquid. But a woman might use her bare hands with the dishwashing liquid, but also a general house cleaner, and also car detergents and things like that. So one item, the toxicity level might be okay, but what if you multiply that and it's in body creams or makeups, or so how do we know what it means?
The cumulative effect here.
The cumulative effect.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that is a very good question. I mean, that's a key question, and because what we're talking about, I mean, it's it on the head, is not exactly like a daily exposure to one thing or another has enough toxic substance to make you ill or have any effect. I mean, we're talking about very small quantities, but very small quantities that build up over time, over years and years and years. And those quantities often mix with other chemicals that have additional qualities. And so you're kind of walking around, think of 148 chemicals in your body like right now.
Those are the ones we tested for.
Those are the ones we tested for. I mean, there might be other ones we haven't even tested for. So think about how those interact with one another. Well, the American regulatory system has no capacity, and it's explicitly very focused on single chemicals having single effects, which I think is a very conscious effort, because the rulemaking apparatus in the EPA has been shaped, I think, largely by industry. And so right now the regulatory authorities don't have the capacity to look at all these combined elements that you're talking about. And whereas I think that kind of sophistication is possible, and in fact the Europeans are using that kind of sophistication to begin to determine what's hazardous and what isn't hazardous. But it takes a real willingness to try to understand the science, deal with the complexities of the science, and comprehend that chemicals don't work in single ways. It's not a perfect cause and effect. You have this and you have that comes out of it. No, you have a chemical and you have multiple other chemicals, and it's got certain qualities that can influence certain parts of the body in certain ways, and they can accumulate over time. And that takes a certain amount of appreciation for the complexity of science, and we have not seen that in America yet.
And it also really draws the enormous difference between what's happening in the EU and what's happening in the United States, and that's in terms of the guiding principle or philosophy behind how they make these decisions. The EU is guided by what's called the precautionary principle. Explain what that is.
Yes, that is a key difference between the United States and the European Union. The European Union operates according to the precautionary principle, and according to that principle, meaning precaution, act on the basis of precaution.
Better safe than sorry.
Better safe than sorry. And what that means, in essence, is if an accumulation of scientific information mounts about the dangers of a particular substance, the government can act on that data. If the danger is dangerous enough, for example, if it's going to cause endocrine problems in young children, particularly vulnerable, well, if all the evidence may not be in, there still may be some questions remaining. But if the potential harm is big enough, the government can act. And that's what, one time after another, when dealing with very serious carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins, the European government is acting according to this principle of precaution. In the United States, a very different approach, in that the United States demands an absolute level of proof that everything is settled, that the questions are settled. And number one, any scientist will tell you that that's a near impossible state of perfection to obtain. And once you even overcome that hurdle, you've then got to prove that the costs outweigh the benefits outweigh the costs, and of course the costs have increasingly been meant to mean the cost to industry as opposed to the benefits to society. So the result is that the United States hasn't banned a single chemical in 20 years.
And they didn't ban one that they talked about just a month ago. And I'm going to read a quote from a newspaper article, and this is about bisphenol A, which was banned in the EU. At this moment, with all information in front of us, we do not believe we have the data on which we could base a regulatory ban, and that's according to the FDA's Office of Food Additive Safety. So we haven't banned a chemical in 20 years.
Right.
So what is the level, the breaking point?
Well, it's what evidence the government chooses to look at. So the evidence is there around BPA, for example. I mean, there's a mountain of data, and you have close to about more than 100, about 110 studies that have been done on BPA, and about 80% of those studies have shown potential problems, neurological, endocrine problems with BPA, which is this plastic stuff in bottles. About another 20 of those have shown no problems. So the government, FDA, chose to say that because there are 20 out of the 80 that say, well, there really aren't problems, that we will go with those decisions. There are enough questions remaining about the certainty of this science that we're going to go with that conclusion that these are safe. I mean, it turns out that a high number of those 20 were funded by the industry, so the plastics industry itself. So the question is, what does the government choose to act upon? That is where the criteria, that's where the key matter is. You have a mountain of evidence this high on chemical after chemical after chemical. You have a mountain of evidence this high. The government can choose to wait till it gets that high and gets a little higher, or it can act when it gets this high because the potential dangers are so great that the harm, the potential harm from taking it out of circulation is far less than the benefit of removing it from circulation. And that's the essential difference.
Well, I guess what I'm having trouble reconciling is I can't imagine that government workers in Europe are better people necessarily than in the United States. So I think there must be some other motivation. The Europeans are doing this not just to be good, but bottom line, this must be working out okay. And I'm wondering if it has anything to do with universal health care.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I can assure you it has nothing to do with whether Europeans are better than Americans. In Europe, you basically have universal health care, which essentially means that the government pays for health care. Now, this is an issue that's obviously been a hot one here in the United States, a very hot one, but the fact is we don't yet have that kind of a system. So we individuals pay for health care. And one of the key things is I watched the debate happen in Europe about some of these things, and there was debate over there. There was quite a bit of back and forth before these initiatives came in. And one of the most powerful arguments was made as to the economic consequences of not removing these chemicals from circulation, because the health consequences were going to be paid by the government. So the governments of the European Union now estimate that they are saving in health costs close to around $75 billion over the next 15 years from the health costs of people going to the hospital because of health care related to chemical exposure. Here in the United States, we individually pay those costs. Each of us individually, God forbid, get in this kind of situation. We are paying those costs individually. So we bear that burden ourselves, and the government is under no financial pressure, at least explicit financial pressure, to essentially invest in our health. And I think that's one of the huge differences between the two.
Okay, we'll go to another question.
I have a conspiracy theory that's itching my brain, and I just want to know if there's any foundation. All these chemicals is making our society sick, and there's a higher incidence of cancer and whatnot. And the health industry here is a money-making proposition. So, and I am not an advocate of the methods used to treat cancer. I feel that they are ineffective, highly expensive, and it is just a money-making business that doesn't really treat the problem. So is there something going on with these chemical companies together with the pharmaceuticals that are, you get sick on one side and you make money for the other industry, and they're kind of feeding off our society. And I think that the solution is very much in what you said, that once it becomes a universal insurance, then the government is going to step in, because they will not be able to afford to keep up this shenanigans anymore.
I'm not quite sure I'd go so far as to say that the chemical or pharmaceutical have a vested interest in us becoming sick. I don't think I'd go that far, or I wouldn't go that far. So I'm not sure I concede your conspiracy. If you look at the way we handle things like cancer and we handle these kind of chronic diseases, there's an enormous effort on treatment, as there should be if it works. I mean, if, God forbid, you want good treatment. But I think there's really been a de-emphasizing of prevention, and I think prevention is key. And what does prevention mean? But prevention is a very loaded term. It's not just means eat your vegetables and take a run every week, which hopefully you do now and again. But if you take prevention seriously, you actually have to start looking at the potential contributors in the society that could be contributing to those conditions. And that means getting the chemicals out of circulation that could be contributing to cancer. For example, why are simulated versions of estrogen in women's cosmetics? This really surprised me when I found out that there's kind of estrogen mimickers, which is already a pretty lively hormone for female.
So the hormones that are plumping up our cattle can also plump up your skin, so that you don't look like you have wrinkles.
Right. But they
women
could also
don't realize that there are hormone inhibitors in these things.
Exactly.
Well, here's what's interesting. The assumption among Americans is that if it's on the shelf, it's safe. Or I couldn't sell this to you if it weren't safe. And in Europe, that fantasy has gone away. And I'm wondering what accounts for that difference in attitude?
Do you have a comment on that? Oh, good. Sounds.
Hi, I'm Herbert. I'm from Austria.
Oh,
so I do know the answer to your question. It's a grassroots information campaign. I was part of that. And it was partly before email, but then, we just send information to everybody. And I think that is what we need to do here. There's a lack of information, and that's why these things can happen.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
in fact, there are grassroots campaigns that you've written about in your book. You write about the Safe Cosmetics campaign. And these women and environmentalists. Tell us what they're doing and with what impact.
There's a Safe Cosmetics campaign that started in California, has now gone totally national. And what they did was they basically said the cosmetics are the cancer, mutagens, reproductive toxins have to be taken out of cosmetics in Europe. So they went to American cosmetic companies and they asked them, they said, will you sign a pledge to take out all the stuff from your cosmetics that are being removed from European cosmetics? And their striking thing was they got an abundance of ads from the smaller ones, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you go to more health food kind of stores, smaller companies, and none from the big ones. You know, the big companies said they refused to sign it. And this got them kind of worked up a little bit. They responded to that by going to the state of California, and they got a bill through the state of California now saying that at least the ingredients have to be reported to the state of California that are what are in cosmetics, but that still doesn't exist on the federal level. I was just speaking like a week or two ago, just because I think it's so interesting. There's a whole group of teenage girls who are kind of basically outraged.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, outraged at the kind of cosmetics that they want to start using, and they're like in high school and everything. And so they've launched this thing called Teens for Safe Cosmetics, because they think it's ridiculous that we have all this stuff. I think as I travel across the country too, I get the sense that people are getting more and more unnerved and unsettled by the material that they're putting into their bodies, and this is growing.
You point out in your book that there are tens of millions of American women who use, on average, 9 personal care products a day, many of which have these chemicals in them. And really the only thing you're protected by in the United States is a law that dates back to 1938, and so it's really an industry that's self-regulated.
Totally self-regulated,
Tell us about the Cosmetics Directive, which is what's in place in Europe.
That says that the European Union, any cosmetic that contains cancer-causing substances, that causes mutation in human genes or causes reproductive damage, is banned from cosmetics. So you can't have them in European cosmetics. It's actually quite a huge step that the Europeans have taken. And they even published a list called the negative list of all the substances that can't be in cosmetics anymore.
Can we get our hands on it?
You can get your hands on it. You can look it up. It's on the web, a negative list, European Union, and relates to cosmetics, and it's a list of all these substances that you can't use. It includes things like jet fuel and things like that you obviously don't want to use anyway, but it also includes certain substances, you know, that cause these cancer-causing, these contributors. And whereas in America, the striking thing is that the cosmetics industry is basically totally self-regulated. Every effort to regulate the cosmetics industry has been beaten back by an industry lobbying campaign. So we're now in the position of saying, trust us. The cosmetics industry says, trust us. We'll tell you if something's a problem. But there's no mechanism to even force them to tell us there's a problem. They have to report to the FDA if their substance, for example, causes a skin rash or something. They have to report that to the FDA. But there's no requirement to report it if it causes like a more chronic illness. Yeah.
Now we have a new administration, and I want to talk about that in just a moment. But first, I want to take another question from the audience. Go ahead, please, sir.
Thank you. It certainly sounds like Europe's been banning products through various legislation, and certainly I guess I'm drawing the conclusion that they're showing reduced cancer or carcinogen rates over there. But my real question is, we're kind of using the terms toxic and chemicals, and are all chemicals toxic?
No. The answer is absolutely not. So it's and I think even this debate gets a little muddled and obscure and foggy when people start talking about chemicals generally, because the issue is not chemicals. The issue is particular chemicals with particular qualities that have particular effects on the human body. So this is not a question of because chemicals can do great things, and we've advanced hugely with humanity with chemicals. And it's also a ruse, though, when the chemical industry says, you know, chemicals are essential to life. Without chemicals, life would be impossible. Number one, it's true. It's totally true. You know, chemicals are important to our modern life. There's no way around it. But to use that as an argument to not pay attention to the particular qualities of particular chemicals is a way, I think, to divert attention from actually the real causes of concern about some chemicals. And so the answer to that is to educate ourselves and get the knowledge that we need about particular chemicals. And my thinking is actually that the chemical industry, they don't agree with me on this yet, but the chemical industry would benefit from a more educated populace, because they wouldn't be shunted aside as some evildoers in society, that they actually produce chemicals, many of which do good things for society, but some of which don't.
Better living through chemistry. Most of us would agree that there's
Right.
truth in that.
There's truth in that. So I'm not disputing that there's absolutely truth in that, but it doesn't follow necessarily that we shouldn't pay attention to some chemicals.
All right. Another question?
My question is, how are you gonna portray to the American people, like, with all these chemicals and toxins, they sometimes put it like blind to it because they're just looking how much it is, like the cost. I think money is a big issue here because they're like, oh, it's cheaper, I'm gonna buy that one, other than the one that's more expensive, even though it might be safer. Like, how are you gonna like tell
There are
people?
How do
social
you deal?
justice implications
Yes,
to all of this.
Yeah, that's a very key question. Yeah.
You can buy one
Right.
product in a fine cosmetic store
Yes.
and perhaps a dangerous one in the dollar store.
Yes, that's exactly. I think that hits at this kind of question of equity, really, of equity. I mean, if you have the resources now to go buy a product that's imported from Europe or is a natural product or something at Whole Foods or wherever it might be, then you have the information and you've got the resources to do that. But without a law that says that all people are, whether they know it or not, most people don't know what toxins they're taking into their body, whether they know it or not, are not going to be subjected to chemical exposure, creates an equity, distributes the equity, the benefits of this over time, and also has an economic consequence, because what happens when the market, when everybody has to do the same thing, the demand for the underlying ingredients that are less toxic than the ones that we have now brings the price down. And that's essentially what happens, is you see a small, in Europe, that's certainly what they see a small spike in the price, and then the price settles down.
42% of nail workers, nail salon workers, are people of color. So I'm wondering if in all of this you've seen racial implications.
Oh, yeah. Huge. I mean, nail salon workers who are obviously lower economic, people on the lower end of the economic spectrum have enormously high rates, I hate to put it this way, but they have very high rates of bladder cancer because of the dyes, the chemicals in hair dyes. And these are studies. These are not coming out of thin air. This is like USC, Harvard, major institutions are showing huge spikes in bladder cancer among nail workers. So you have enormous kind of inequities in society where people who are less, have less resources get exposed probably at a higher rate than we do, than people with more resources or with more knowledge. And I don't think this should be an issue of knowledge. It shouldn't actually matter that you know or not whether these toxins are there. My point is that the government has a responsibility to take those questions seriously, and they can make these kind of determinations based according to a spectrum of evidence.
Another question?
Do you think part of the problem is why companies don't want to remove chemicals is they're in there because they make their products more effective? If they had taken them out, it might cause higher costs for shipping and stuff like that. It might require more uses because it won't be as effective as a product. So they're more hesitant to remove it because their products won't be as effective to the public.
That is often an argument, or can be an argument that's used, but when you actually look at the actual experience, it's rarely, if ever, held up. Because if you go to Europe now, I can assure you that there are plenty of very fine cosmetics, and children have plenty of toys to play with, and people have electronic devices just like we do, cars just like we do. The notion that these kind of initiatives will send us back to some earlier primitive 19th century age of sort of wooden toys and Geppetto in a little workshop is totally ridiculous, because basically when you force a company through laws, that's why laws are important, to actually take certain materials out, what happens? Well, they go figure out what else to put in there. And none of these companies will go out of business. They figure out what the next thing is to put in. That's what innovation is. And so I think we have to get over this idea that it's going to drive us out of business, or it's going to drive
And we have
into
figured a few things out in this country. They've taken lead out of paint.
Yeah,
Paint
yeah,
still works.
yeah.
Freon out of air conditioners.
Yeah,
We're still
yeah.
cooled by air conditioners.
Yeah, They took CFCs out of the whole economy, sodium dioxide, the whole thing that was part of the creation of acid rain. They took that out of the manufacturing processes. I mean, there are a number of things that when the government says this is too dangerous, you can't do it anymore, industry goes. They don't go hightail and go, okay, we're going out of business, goodbye. They actually go figure out, and that is the great power of the ingenuity and the innovation here in America. I mean, there are great thinking going on.
I want to get to the new administration. Under the Obama administration, we have a new regulatory czar in Cass Sunstein. He's a Harvard law professor, and he is a critic of applying the precautionary principle, which is used throughout Europe. He says that it's counterintuitive. He says that it was the precautionary principle that got us into Iraq. He says it's the precautionary principle that allows people in tropical climates to die from malaria when DDT could have solved that problem. So how do you respond to that, and what do you think this portends for this new administration? Yeah,
I think it is pretty interesting that Cass Sunstein was put in this position. And Cass Sunstein is a person whose writings and thinkings is something I've admired, actually, on a number of ranges, because he's also involved in very important things, freedom of the press and right to privacy. He's a very eloquent legal mind. He is clearly the most articulate critic of the precautionary principle who I've been able to find, and he's clearly not connected to industry. I don't believe he has some industry connection, which a lot of critics of the precautionary principle have. Which Cass Sunstein does not have. And I think he comes at it from a very rigorous legal analysis. However, I think he's got some flawed thinking. And basically, here's, for example, I think some comparison he makes. The risks of taking a particular chemical out of circulation must be weighed against the risks of preventing of the chemical company experiencing some economic hardship, or putting restraints on the innovation that the chemical company might otherwise do, or basically that there are equivalent risks on either side.
All choices have risks.
All choices have risks. Why go after chemicals, which after all in the end might directly affect, contribute to a medical condition, and let's say I don't know this number exactly, but let's say 1 out of 500,000 people. Whereas car accidents driving above the speed limit cause deaths in 1 out of 250,000 people. So society should spend more time on the car speed than on the chemical issue. I think there's huge flaws in equating these risks, and yet so his motives I believe are rigorous, but I actually have real problems with his analysis. So this tension is going to come to a head because you have people who are more inclined to regulate, and from the bodies of the EPA and et cetera, and you have Cass Sunstein, whose indications are essentially that he has a little bit of unease about regulation, and there's going to be some very interesting tension, I think.
In fact, he's predicted that an Obama administration will be inclined to deregulate.
And if that happens, we will be reporting the consequences.
Speaking of reporting the consequences, this comes to light because of investigative reporters like you, and investigative reporting is more expensive, more time-consuming, more risky in terms of the chances of litigation. And I'm wondering just how stable, how healthy the investigative journalism world is.
Well, it's a tough time right now for investigative reporting. The systems of support for enabling journalists to go spend the time and resources that it often takes to really unearth the real story behind the reality that we see every day. It's an expensive proposition. It takes time. It takes determination. And what we've seen is the collapse of the traditional sources of support through the newspapers, and we used to have a great newspaper here in Pennsylvania, the Inquirer, who went through this starting in the 90s. And the constriction of support to really strong journalism is very serious. I don't think investigative reporting, though, is going to disappear because, one, because I still know people doing it, and I'm trying to do it myself, but because as long as people really are curious and demand the information that's out there about our, the conditions in our society, you're going to have investigative reporters. The question now is how can they be sustained over time? I mean, the instincts, the skills are there. Increasingly, we have, where I work, Center for Investigative Reporting, we are a nonprofit journalism organization. It started some 30 years ago. And the idea being that the traditional market forces don't support this kind of investigative reporting. So we get funding from foundations and individuals who believe that investigative reporting is important to an informed democracy. And without that real information, we really don't have a functioning democracy. So we have a staff of about 10 people that do reporting in a whole array of area. I do environment. We have other people doing civil liberties, the war on terror, et cetera, et cetera. And we work with outlets. So we produce books. We do television documentaries with Frontline and other outlets. We do magazine work and newspaper work and radio, NPR. And that, I think, is going to be a new model for investigative reporters. I think there are a number of other organizations like that that are emerging in different parts of the country that are beginning to take those ideas and trying to find a sustained form of support that's outside the traditional means of support. And I think that's where we're going now. And I think actually it could end up being a very positive thing because people who are who are really skilled at doing this and can spend the time doing it can be in an environment of other investigative reporters. I work with other investigative reporters. We get ideas from one another.
Not everything pans out, and I'm wondering how patient those who are paying for this are and how important a center is, because as you said, you publish books, your articles end up in The Nation, New York Times, Harper's.
LA Times, Harper's Magazine. I think these kind of nonprofit centers are going to be an increasingly large part of the investigative journalism world. And we'll see. We've already got a number out there that are kind of following the center's model.
Okay, we go to another question from the audience. Go ahead, please.
Hi. You said that investigative journalism right now is going through a tough time, and obviously because of all the economic impacts and the time that it takes, so a lot of big news outlets don't like to spend the time. And obviously organizations like you're a part of help, but what do you think it would take to bring back investigative journalism to what it was before so the public could really see what was going on behind the sort of like facade of reality?
First of all, I think we have to get away a little bit from the notion that there was ever kind of a halcyon day of investigative reporting. There was no some golden era, where investigative reporters were abundantly paid and, celebrated by society and, given like parking permits to go places. It's always been a struggle. And it's always been when you report on powerful institutions, private, public, as well as individuals, it's not like you're necessarily making a lot of friends out there among people with money, among people with resources.
They're not spreading your name
around.
They're not
spreading your name around.
Mark
They're happy to see you, exactly. And you don't get like whole television channels devoted to every movement of your existence. They don't rate your fashion sense or anything like that. So investigative reporters have never been exactly popular, in that. And there's always been this tension between those who want to do investigative reporters and those with the strings on the outlet. So that said, I think it's clear that we are going through an era where there are greater constrictions than there have been in the past. I think that there's no question about that. How to bring that back is a multiple level challenge. One, I think the public needs to understand how important this is. And when you think about how important it is, think about, it's hard to actually identify what is the effect of investigative reporting. I get this all the time. It's like, well, what effect has your stories had? And the fact is that it's rare that you can actually say, well, my story changed this law or had this effect. I mean, it's actually rare. With this book, it actually has influenced, I think, a few state laws. I've done a few little briefings in various states. But I think for the most part, in most stories I do and other people, it's very hard to identify a particular effect. But think about where you would be today if those stories hadn't come out, is all you can consider. Think about what would happen if you didn't know, for example, about the, let's say, the run-up to the Iraq War, some very good investigative reporting, which didn't, unfortunately, change the course of history, but it did change our understanding of the war to realize about the lack of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We know that now because of investigative reporters who did that work. And imagine a world where we didn't know that. So I think this and multiplied by hundreds and hundreds of other stories gives you a sense of what the world would be like without investigative journalism.
It was stories like yours that caused the city council in San Francisco to attempt to ban phthalates.
Right.
What happened there?
Yes, the city council of San Francisco got ahead of the curve, and phthalates are this kind of plastic softener that, like on the cover of the book, a little plastic duck. As a plastic that makes toys very soft and malleable, also is on your shower curtains, dashboard of your car, things that are actually malleable plastic often use phthalates. Well, a lot of studies have been done showing that phthalates actually can contribute to decreased testosterone production in male infants, particularly dependent on their mother's exposure during gestation and all that. So this is kind of an unpleasant concept to think about. And, but a mountain of evidence is rising suggesting that's the case. So the Europeans banned phthalates 10 years ago. The San Francisco City Council decided, well, we don't exactly want our kids sucking on toys that contain a testosterone disrupting substance, and decided to ban the sale of toys with phthalates in the city of San Francisco. So what was the reaction of the toy industry in the city of San Francisco? They come up and say, well, thank God you pointed out a potential hazard from our product, and we're with you in protecting San Francisco children. In fact, the exact opposite happened, where the toy industry sued the city of San Francisco, saying it was an improper action to be taken on a city level, saying it was not the city's authority to do such a thing, and got it stuck in court. The great irony was that in their legal argument, they basically, which was the Toy Manufacturers of America plus a retail association of toy retailers did this lawsuit. And in their argument, they argued that it was the state's responsibility, not the city's responsibility. Of course, over the previous years, they'd launched major lobbying campaigns to prevent the state from doing the same thing. And by the way, the phthalates have been taken out of toys 10 years ago in Europe.
And in fact, China's making toys for Europe without phthalates and sending us toys with phthalates.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out.
And
exactly,
meanwhile,
that's what yes.
Americans are in an uproar over painted toys that have lead in them that have been shipped from China, and that story has sort of overshadowed what perhaps may be a more important one, the phthalate story. You mentioned the health effects. There's actually a syndrome, phthalate syndrome, which they're finding in rats.
The China thing was a big, huge. It got everybody aware of the toxic elements in everyday life and all that, and I think it probably educated Americans. But it also diverted our attention to think it was the Chinese. It was Chinese sneaking their devious little products into our sort of perfect, pristine living rooms and homes, and it was the devious Chinese trying to sort of poison Americans, which was really preposterous. The fact is that the regulatory ability of the United States to regulate and oversee the types of products coming into our country has been systematically decimated. And every effort to expand the parameters of the government's ability to monitor toxins has been held back. And so I think it's actually interesting both to look at the Chinese, to look at the actual legal toxins. Legal toxins, that's the issue. The issue is legal toxins and why they're still legal.
You say in your book that not only is the United States no longer writing environmental laws, but that if we don't comply with EU's standards, everything from U.S. foods to cosmetics will be blocked at the borders. And so I'm wondering, what is it that the U.S. can do to become relevant, to have a say, to, again, have a leadership role in environmental policy?
Well, we have had an election. Elections do make a difference in our country, and we still have a very vibrant democracy. And this election, I think, has actually brought a whole new people into government. So the United States is now faced with a situation that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago. The idea that the United States was the dumping ground for products that are banned elsewhere. So I think that Obama faces a real opportunity to really make America a global leader again when it comes to environmental leadership, and because it also not only is it environmental leadership, but it's also good economics, and I think it's clear it's good economics. The amount of new jobs that have been created. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book is to show, here's a model. This is what an economy, one of the biggest world economy is doing. We can learn. There may be things we can learn from that because new jobs have come out of it, new market share, new products, a whole array of things.
Just the opposite of what they said would
happen. Just the opposite of what had been predicted. So there's an enormous amount that I think both can be learned. And then let's not forget the United States did pioneer some of these measures years ago before they were kind of rolled back. We have enormous amount of capacity, both at the EPA and other scientific institutions around this country. And I think we can regain a leadership role both on chemicals, but also on climate change and all the other areas. And I think it needs pressure. And like this gentleman said, I think it actually there needs to be pressure from below, because I guarantee you there's going to be pressure from above.
Okay.
And yeah.
We're going to take one more question and then wrap things up. Go ahead, please.
For the average American whose eyes may just have been opened to this problem by your book and by this discussion tonight, what would be your best advice on how to become informed and how to be safe?
What Americans can do is actually break out of the presumption that somebody else is taking care of this problem. And if you do that, then you will seek out the information, and you can find it. It's out there. And you can also begin to demand that the leaders of this country provide that information, provide those levels of safety to you.
And on that note, we are out of time. I'd like to thank our studio audience and our guest, Mark Schapiro. He is editorial director of the Center for Investigative Reporting in San Francisco and the author of Exposed: The Toxic Chemistry of Everyday Products and What's at Stake for American Power. For all of us here at Penn State Public Broadcasting, I'm Patty Satalia. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU. A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.